So when I was around 9 or 10, I was in church, and my pastor puts 2 jars on the altar. And next to the altar, there's a pile of rocks that were about yay big, right? So pretty decent sized rocks. And then a bag of pebbles and another bag of sand. And he called a kid forward. I don't remember what kid it was, but he called a kid forward. And he tells the kid, take this jar, so one of the 2 jars, and I want you to pour all this sand in this jar. So the kid does it and pours all the sand in the jar. And then he goes, okay, now I want you to put all the pebbles in the jar. And so now the jar is pretty full because it's got, all that sand on those pebbles. So there's not much room at the top. And he points to the rocks and goes, I want you to put every single one of these rocks in this jar. And of course, the kid's trying to shove it in and like move stuff around and rearrange it, but he just can't do it because there's too much stuff in the jar. Then he points to the other jar and he goes, I want you to do the same thing, but put the rocks in first. So he put the rocks in first, and then he put the pebbles in. The pebbles slid and moved around nicely around the rocks as he poured them in. So the pebbles, moved around and bounced around inside, so they filled the cracks of the rocks. Then he said to put the sand in, and the sand filled and moved around and filled in the cracks between the pebbles. And he was able to fit everything in that jar. What this story tells us is the importance of putting priorities first, right? A lot of people talk about how they just can't fit everything in their life. They don't have time for their family. They don't have time for their friends. They don't have time to exercise. But they do have time to scroll on TikTok for 4 hours. It's one of those things where it's like, you can't fit everything in if you're putting the sand in first, right? The sand in your life would be things like social media, watching TV, playing video games, like little kind of pointless dopamines that can add to your life and make it a little more full when you have all that stuff in there. But for the most part, these things don't add that much, right? They don't amount to very much when you have little tiny bits of sand. They don't matter very much. Then the pebbles are things like your house, your mortgage you had to pay off, your credit card bills, your taxes, your car, and your gasoline bill every day, and your lawnmower, just stuff like that, stuff that's important to have and you kind of need to survive, like food and water and shelter. But they're not entirely necessary. You can live without a lawnmower. You can live without a car. You can live without a house. You can be homeless, but you can still be alive and you can still be happy. Because what matters is the rocks. These rocks are things like God and your faith, and they're things like family, and they're things like your friends and your partners and things like that, stuff that genuinely matters and brings so much life to you, right? Things that you really can't live without. But the problem is people think they'll be happy if they prioritize the sand, if they have more pleasure, if they have more dopamine, if they scroll on social media for longer, if they watch more TV, if they play more video games. They think they'll be happy. But they won't, because they're just not able to fit all that stuff in. So what do we do? Well, all we really have to do is put God first, put him above. He's the biggest rock that we have, right? Because family and friends, those are some of the greatest things that could ever be in your life. But without God, none of them would exist. Without God, you wouldn't exist because he created you, right? No matter what you believe in, universe, if you say you're spiritual and not religious, whatever, right? But God, the universe, whatever you want to call him, he created you and he cares about you and he loves you. And without him, there wouldn't even be the sand, right? So if you can't fit that rock into your life, if you can't fit the most important, biggest, shiniest rock that you could find in that jar, then you're doing something wrong. You're putting the sand first, the pebbles first, or whatever you're doing wrong. Because if you can't fit them in, then none of it matters. I believe it was a Bible story of God being the cornerstone, right? Because when you build a building out of bricks or stones, the cornerstone is the most important. Because the cornerstone is not only what you start with, but it's also the strongest. Because if that stone is in there wrong, if it's in there loosely, because when you have two walls like this, right, the cornerstone is the one that holds the walls together, right? And so if you have a weak cornerstone, then you have weak walls, right? So when God is your cornerstone and he is the strongest stone imaginable, like you have this giant block of diamond, right? Like Minecraft, like you have a giant, huge chunk of diamond and that is your cornerstone. You're going to have the strongest house imaginable. But if your cornerstone's a pile of mud, you're going to have a pretty crappy house, right? And the Bible has countless accounts of this. Like, this is not just like me saying like, oh, hoop-de-doo, you need God in your life or whatever, right? Like, the Bible says countless times the importance of putting God first in your life. There's another story there's two guys, right? One guy, they're both building houses, right? And one guy builds a house on like a beach, and it's just sand, right? And sand, as we know, is not very strong, and he builds an entire house on sand. So a huge, very heavy house on a beach, right? A pile of sand, and it's not packed sand either. It's like it's sand dune. It's terrible. And the other guy builds his house on rock, a foundation of just stone, right? One of the strongest natural materials. And a storm comes and like a massive hurricane blows in. And the guys who built his house on sand, of course, his house falls over. It falls apart. It can't handle the storm. The guy who built his house on rock, he's able to shelter his family and his animals and his friends in his house because his house is sturdy and can weather the storm. Your life is these houses, right? Because if you don't have God to fall back on, when the storm comes and bad things happen, like say you lose your car, say you lose your job or your money, or like you miss car payments and your car is gone, you miss paying off your house and your house is taken away by the bank. If you're not able to fall back on your faith and your values and God, then you're just going to collapse. You're just going to fall apart, right? You're going to have no idea what to do. You're going to be a mess. But the strong religious people who built their lives around God and Jesus, they're able to fall back on that. They're able to fall back on their core values, and they're able to, like, see bad things happening. Like, okay, this is bad, but it's God's plan, and I know it's going to work out. And they're able to calmly work through their issues, and they're able to calmly solve the problem. So get your priorities straight. Because the Bible told us to. No, I'm telling you to. My pastor told me to. This is something that you absolutely have to do. You have to build your life based on God. You have to put the rocks first. You have to have a strong cornerstone, and you have to have a strong foundation, and you're going to have the best, most filling life imaginable. And I truly do mean that. That's all I got for today. God bless you. Stay wild.